Chapter 13, End of Summer. A trumpet has 3 little valves. They are for the fingers of the player. By pushing them down in the right order, the player can produce all the notes of the musical scale. Louis had often examined these 3 little valves on his horn, but he had never been able to use them. He had 3 front toes on each foot, but, being a water bird, he had webbed feet. The webbing prevented him from using his 3 toes independently. Luckily, the valves on a trumpet are not needed for bugle calls, because bugle calls are just combinations of do, mi, and so, and a trumpeter can play do, mi, and so without pressing down any of the valves. If I could just work those 3 valves with my 3 toes, he said to himself, I could play all sorts of music, not just bugle calls. I could play jazz. I could play country and western. I could play rock. I could play the great music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Sibelius, Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Brahms, everybody. I could really be a trumpet player, not just a camp bugler. I might even get a job with an orchestra. The thought filled him with ambition. Louis loved music, and besides, he was already casting about for ways of making money after camp was over. Although he enjoyed life at Camp Kookooskoos, Louis often thought of his home on Upper Red Rock Lake in Montana. He thought about his parents, his brothers and sisters, and about Serena. He was terribly in love with Serena, and he often wondered what was happening to her. At night, he would look up at the stars and think about her. In the late evening, when the big bullfrogs were calling tronk across the still lake, he would think of Serena. Sometimes he felt sad, lonely, and homesick. His music, however, was a comfort to him. He loved the sound of his own trumpet. Summer passed all too quickly. On the last day of camp, Mr. Brickle called his counselors together and paid them what he owed them. Louis received $100, the first money he had ever earned. He had no wallet and no pockets, so Mr. Brickle placed the money in a waterproof bag that had a drawstring. He hung this money bag around Louis's neck, along with the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil, and the life-saving medal. Louis went to Sam Beaver's tent and found Sam packing his things. Louis took off his slate and pencil. I need another job, he wrote. Where should I go? Sam sat down on his bed and thought for a while. Then he said, Go to Boston. Maybe you can get a job with a Swan boat. Louis had never been to Boston, and he had no idea what the Swan boat was. But he nodded his head. Then on his slate he wrote, Do me a favor. Sure, said Sam. Take a razor blade and slit the web on my right foot so I can wiggle my toes. He held out his foot. Why do you want to wiggle your toes? Asked Sam. You'll see, wrote Louis. I need my toes in my business. Sam hesitated. Then he borrowed a razor blade from one of the older counselors. He made a long, neat cut between Louis's inner toe and middle toe. Then he made another cut between Louis's middle toe and outer toe. Does it hurt? Louis shook his head. He lifted his trumpet, placed his toes on the valves, and played Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. Do, Ti, La, So, Fa, Mi, Re, Do. Go! Sam grinned. The Swan boat will hire you, all right, he said. You're a real trumpeter now, but with your web cut, swimming will be harder for you. You will have a tendency to swim in circles, because your left foot will push better than your right foot. I can manage, wrote Louis. Thanks very much for the surgery. Next day, the campers left. The canoes had been hoisted onto racks in the boathouse. The float had been hauled onto the beach. The windows of the lodge had been boarded up against bears and squirrels. Mattresses had been packed into zipper bags. Everything was snug and ready for the long, silent winter. Of all the campers, only Louis stayed behind. His flight feathers were growing fast, but he still couldn't fly. He made up his mind he would remain at camp all alone until he was able to take to the air again, and then he would fly straight to Boston. The lake was lonely without the boys, but Louis didn't mind being alone. For the next 3 weeks, he took life easy. He grew his flight feathers, dreamed of Serena by day and by night, and practiced his trumpet. He had listened to music all summer. Several of the boys had radios and record players, and now he practiced the songs on his trumpet. Every day he got better and better. One day he composed a love song for Serena and wrote the words and music on his slate. Oh, ever in the greening spring, by bank and bough retiring, for love shall I be sorrowing, and swans of my desiring. He was really thinking of Serena, but he left her name out of it and kept it impersonal. His plumage was beautiful now, and he felt great. On the 21st of September he tried his wings. To his great relief they lifted him. Louis rose into the air. The trumpet banged against the slate knocked against the money bag, the life-saving medal clinked against the chalk pencil, but Louis was airborne again. He climbed and headed for Boston. It was wonderful to be in the sky again. Flying is a lot harder than it was before I acquired all these possessions, thought Louis. The best way to travel, really, is to travel light. On the other hand, I have to have these things. I've got to have the trumpet if I am to win Serena for my wife. I've got to carry this money bag to hold the money to pay my father's debts. I've got to have the slate and pencil so I can communicate with people. And I ought to wear the medal because I really did save a life, and if I didn't wear it, people might think I was ungrateful. On and on he flew toward Boston, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and which is famous for its baked beans, its codfish, its tea parties, its Cabots, its Lowells, its Saltonstalls, and its swan boats. Chapter 14. Boston. Louis liked Boston the minute he saw it from the sky. Far beneath him was a river. Near the river was a park. In the park was a lake. In the lake was an island. On the shore was a dock. Tied to the dock was a boat shaped like a swan. The place looked ideal. There was even a very fine hotel nearby. Louis circled twice, then glided down and splashed to a stop in the lake. Several ducks swam up to look him over. The park was called the Public Garden. Everybody in Boston knows about it and goes there to sit on benches in the sun, to stroll about, to feed the pigeons and the squirrels, and to ride the swan boat. A ride costs 25 cents for grown-ups, 15 cents for children. After a short rest and a bite to eat, Louis swam over to the dock and climbed out on the shore. The man who was taking tickets for the swan boat ride seemed surprised to see an enormous white swan wearing so many things around his neck. "Hello," said the boatman. Louis lifted his trumpet. "Coho," he replied. At the sound, every bird in the park looked up. The boatman jumped. Boston residents, as far as a mile away, looked up and said, "What's that?" Nobody in Boston had ever heard a trumpet or swan. The sound made a big impression. People eating a late breakfast in the Ritz Hotel on Arlington Street looked up from their food. Waiters and bellboys said, "What's that?" The man in charge of the swan boat was probably the most surprised man in Boston. He examined Louis's trumpet, his money bag, his life-saving medal, his slate, and his chalk pencil. Then he asked Louis what he wanted. Louis wrote on his slate, "Have trumpet, need work." "Okay," said the boatman, "you've got yourself a job. A boat leaves here in 5 minutes for a trip around the lake. Your job will be to swim in front of the boat, leading the way and blowing your horn." "What salary do I get?" asked Louis on his slate. "We'll settle that later when we see how you make out," said the boatman. "This is just a tryout." Louis nodded. He arranged his things neatly around his neck, entered the water quietly, took up a position a few yards in front of the boat, and waited. He wondered what would make the boat go. He couldn't see any outboard motor, and there were no oars. In the forward part of the boat were benches for the passengers. In the stern was a structure that was shaped like a swan. It was hollow. Inside of it was a seat, like a bicycle seat. And there were two pedals inside, like the pedals of a bicycle. When the passengers were all aboard, a young man appeared. He climbed onto the stern of the boat and sat down on the seat inside the hollow swan-shaped structure and began to push the pedals with his feet, as though he were riding a bike. A paddle wheel began to turn. The boatman cast the lines off, and as the young man pedaled, the swan boat slowly moved out into the lake. Louis led the way, swimming with his left foot, holding his trumpet with his right foot. "Coho," said Louis's trumpet. The wild sound rang loud and clear and stirred everyone's blood. Then, realizing that he should play something appropriate, Lewis played a song he had heard the boys sing at camp. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. The Swan boat passengers were beside themselves with joy and excitement. A real live swan playing a trumpet. Life was a dream, all right. What a lark, what fun, what pleasure. This is real groovy, cried a boy in the front seat. That bird is as good as Louis Armstrong, the famous trumpet player. I'm going to call him Louis. When Louis heard this, he swam alongside the boat, took his chalk pencil in his mouth and wrote, "That's actually my name." "Hey, how about that?" yelled the boy. "This swan can write, too. Louis can write. Let's give him a cheer." The passengers cheered loudly. Louis swam ahead again, leading the way. Slowly and gracefully, the boat circled the island, while Louis played "Gentle on My Mind" on his trumpet. It was a lovely September morning, hazy and warm. Trees were beginning to show their autumn colors. Louis played "Old Man River." When the Swan boat docked and the passengers got off, long lines of people were waiting to get aboard for the next ride. Business was booming. Another boat was being made ready to accommodate the crowds. Everyone wanted to ride the swan boats behind a real live swan playing a trumpet. It was the biggest happening in Boston in a long time. People liked strange events and queer happenings, and the Swan boat, with Louis out front leading the way, suddenly became the most popular attraction in Boston. "You're hired," said the boatman when Louis climbed out onto the bank. "With you playing the trumpet, I can double my business. I can triple it. I can quadruple it. I can quintuple it. I can sextuple it. Anyway, I'll give you a steady job." Louis lifted his slate. "What salary?" he asked. The boatman gazed around the crowds waiting to get aboard. $100 a week," he said. "I'll pay you $100 every Saturday if you'll swim ahead of the boats and play your horn. Is it a deal?" Louis nodded his head. The man seemed pleased but puzzled. "If it isn't too much to ask," said the boatman, "would you mind telling me why you're so interested in money?" "Everybody is," replied Louis on his slate. "Yeah, I know," said boatman. "Everybody likes money. It's a crazy world, but I mean, why would a swan need money? You can get your meals just by dipping down and pulling up tasty plants at the bottom of the lake. What do you need money for?" Louis erased his slate. "I'm in debt," he wrote, and he thought about his poor father who had stolen the trumpet, and about the poor storekeeper in Billings who had been robbed and whose store had been damaged. Louis knew he must go on earning money until he could pay off what he owed. "Okay," said the boatman, addressing the crowd. "This swan says he's in debt. All aboard for the next ride." And he began selling tickets. The boatman owned several boats, all of them shaped like a swan. Pretty soon, every boat was full and money was flowing in. All day long, the swan boats circled the lake, carrying their load of happy people, many of them children. Louis played his trumpet as he had never played it before. He liked the job. He loved to entertain people, and he loved music. The boatman was just as pleased as he could be. When the day was over and the boats had made their last trip, the boatman walked over to Louis, who was standing on shore arranging his things. "You've done great," said the boatman. "You're a good swan. I wish I'd had you long ago. And now, where are you planning to spend the night?" "Here on the lake," Louis wrote. "Well, I don't know about that," said the man uneasily. "An awful lot of people are curious about you. They might make trouble for you. Bad boys might molest you. I don't trust the people who hang around this park at night. You might get kidnapped. I don't want to lose you. I think I'll take you across to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and get you a room for the night. It's clean and the food is good. It would be safer. Then I can be sure you'll come to work in the morning." Louis didn't think much of the idea, but he agreed to go. He thought, well, I've never spent a night in a hotel. Maybe it would be an interesting experience. So he walked along with the boatman. They left the park and crossed Arlington Street and entered the lobby of the Ritz. It had been a long, tiring day for Louis, but he felt relieved to know that he had a good job and that he could earn money in Boston as a musician. Chapter 15. A Night at the Ritz. When the desk clerk at the Ritz Hotel saw the boatman enter the lobby followed by an enormous snow-white swan with a black beak, the clerk didn't like it at all. The clerk was a carefully dressed man, very neat, his hair nicely combed. The boatman stepped boldly up to the desk. "I'd like a single room for tonight for my friend here," said the boatman. The clerk shook his head. "No birds," he said. "The Ritz doesn't take birds." "You take celebrities, don't you?" asked the boatman. "Certainly," replied the clerk. "You'd take Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, wouldn't you, if they wanted to spend the night?" "Of course," replied the clerk. "You'd take Queen Elizabeth, wouldn't you?" "Of course." "Okay," said the boatman. "My friend here is a celebrity. He is a famous musician. He created a sensation in the public garden this afternoon. You must have heard the commotion. He's a trumpeter, Swan, and plays like the great Armstrong." The clerk gazed suspiciously at Lewis. "Has he any luggage?" asked the clerk. "Luggage?" cried the boatman. "Take a look at him. Look at the stuff he's got with him." "Well, I don't know," said the clerk, staring at Lewis's possessions, his trumpet, his money bag, his slate, his chalk pencil, his life-saving medal. "A bird is a bird. How do I know he hasn't got lice? Birds often have lice. The Ritz won't take anybody that has lice." "Lice?" roared the boatman. "Did you ever see a cleaner guest in your whole life? Look at him. He's immaculate." At this, Lewis held his slate up to the clerk. "No lice," he wrote. The clerk stared in amazement. He was beginning to weaken. "Well, I have to be careful," he said to the boatman. "You say he's a celebrity. How do I know he's famous? You may just be kidding me about that." Just then, 3 young girls entered the lobby. They were giggling and squealing. One of them pointed at Lewis. "There he is!" she screamed. "There he is! I'll get his autograph." The girls rushed up to Lewis. The first girl held out a pad and pencil. "May I have your autograph?" she asked. Lewis took the pencil. Very gracefully he wrote "Lewis" on the pad. More squeals, more giggles, and the girls rushed away. The clerk watched in silence. "There," said the boatman. "Is he a celebrity or isn't he?" The clerk hesitated. He was beginning to think he would have to give Lewis a room. At this point, Lewis had an idea. He lifted his trumpet and began to play an old song called "There's a Small Hotel." "There's a small hotel with a wishing well." His tone was beautiful. Guests passing through the lobby paused to listen. The clerk leaned his elbows on the desk and listened attentively. The man behind the newsstand looked up and listened. People sitting upstairs in the lounge put down their cocktails and listened. The bellboys stared and listened. For a few minutes everything stopped in the lobby while Lewis played. He charmed everyone who could hear. Chambermaids in the bedrooms paused in their work to listen to the trumpet. It was a moment of sheer magic. As the song came to an end, people who knew the words sang them softly. "When the steeple bell says good night, sleep well, we'll thank the small hotel together." "How about that?" asked the boatman, grinning at the clerk. "Is this Swan a musician or isn't he?" "He plays a sweet trumpet," the clerk said. "But there is one more question that I hesitate to bring up. What about his personal habits? Will he mess the room all up? Actors are bad enough. Musicians are worse. I can't allow a large bird to occupy one of our beds. It might put us out of business. Other guests might complain." "I sleep in the bathtub," Lewis wrote on his slate. "Will not disturb bed." The clerk shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Who's going to pay the bill?" he asked. "I am," replied the boatman. "I'll be here early tomorrow morning when Lewis checks out." The clerks couldn't think of any more reasons for not letting the Swan have a room. "Very well," he said. "Sign the register, please." He handed Lewis a pen and a card. Lewis wrote, "Lewis the Swan, Upper Red Rock Lake, Montana." The clerk studied it. He seemed satisfied at last. He summoned a bellboy and handed him a key. "Take this gentleman to his room," he ordered. Lewis removed his medal, his trumpet, his slate, his chalk, pencil, and his money bag, and handed them to the bellboy. Together they walked to the elevators. The boatman said goodbye. "Sleep well, Lewis," called the boatman, "and be ready to come to work promptly in the morning." Lewis nodded. The elevator door opened. "This way, sir," said the bellboy. They entered the elevator and waited for the door to close. A rich smell of perfume filled the air. Lewis stood very still. Then he felt himself rising. The elevator stopped at the 7th floor, and the bellboy led Lewis to a room, unlocked the door, and ushered him in. "Here you are, sir," he said. "Would you like a window open?" The bellboy put Louis's luggage down, snapped on a few lights, opened a window, and laid the room key on the dresser. Then he waited. "I guess he wants a tip," thought Louis. So he went to his money bag, loosened the drawstring, and took out $1. "Thank you very much, sir," said the bellboy, taking the $1. He went out and closed the door softly behind him. Louis was alone at last, alone in a room at the Ritz. Louis had never spent a night alone in a hotel. First he walked around and around, switching lights on and off, examining everything. In the writing desk he found a few sheets of letter paper that said, "Ritz-Carlton, Boston." He felt mussy and dirty, so he went into the bathroom, climbed into the tub, pulled the shower curtain across, and took a shower bath. It felt good and reminded him of the water fights he used to have with his brothers and sisters. He was careful not to splash any water out of the tub. When he was finished, he stood for a while, admiring the bath mat and preening his feathers. Then he felt hungry. On the wall of the bedroom he found a button that said, "Waiter." Louis put his beak against the button and pressed hard. In a few minutes there was a knock at the door, and a waiter entered. He was nicely dressed and tried not to show surprise at finding a Swan in the room. "May I get you something?" he asked. Louis picked up his chalk pencil. 12 watercress sandwiches, please," he wrote on the slate. The waiter thought for a moment. "Are you expecting guests?" he asked. Louis shook his head. "And you want 12 watercress sandwiches?" Louis nodded. "Very good, sir," said the waiter. "Do you wish them with mayonnaise?" Louis didn't know what mayonnaise tasted like, but he thought fast. He cleaned his slate and wrote, 1 with, 11 without. The waiter bowed and left the room. Half an hour later he was back. He rolled a table into the room, placed a huge platter of watercress sandwiches on it, along with a plate, a knife, a fork, a spoon, salt and pepper, a glass of water, and a linen napkin nicely folded. There was also a butter dish with several pieces of butter covered with cracked ice. The waiter arranged everything carefully, then handed Louis a bill to sign. The bill said, 12 watercress sandwiches, $18. Goodness, thought Louis, this is an expensive place. I hope the boatman won't be mad when he sees this supper charge on the bill tomorrow morning. He borrowed a pencil from the waiter and signed the bill, Louis the Swan. The waiter took the bill and stood there waiting. I guess he wants a tip, thought Louis. So he opened his money bag again, drew out $2, and handed it to the waiter, who thanked him, bowed again, and went away. Because a swan has such a long neck, the table was just the right height for Louis. He didn't need a chair. He ate his supper standing up. He tried the sandwich that had mayonnaise on it and decided he didn't like mayonnaise. Then he carefully pulled each sandwich apart. All he really wanted was the watercress. He piled the slices of bread into 2 neat piles, scooped the watercress onto his plate, and had a nice supper. He did not touch the butter. When he was thirsty, instead of drinking from the glass of water, he walked into the bathroom, drew a basin full of cold water, and drank that. Then he took his napkin, wiped his beak, and pushed the table out of the way. He felt much better. To be all alone in a hotel room gives a person a cozy feeling and a feeling of importance. Louis felt great, but soon he began feeling rather lonely, too. He thought of Sam Beaver. He thought of Camp Kookooskoos. He thought of his father and mother and sisters and brothers back home in Montana. He thought of Serena, the swan he loved, and wondered how she was. The words of the song he had played in the lobby came back to him. There's a small hotel with a wishing well. I wish that we were there together. How wonderful it would be, he thought, if Serena could be here at the Ritz to enjoy the hotel with him. The waiter had left an evening paper on a table. Louis glanced at the front page. To his amazement, he saw a picture of himself on the lake in the public garden with a swan boat. A big headline said, "Boston goes wild over the trumpet of the swan." The news story began. There's a new bird in town. His name is Louis. He is a trumpeter swan that really plays the trumpet. Incredible though it may seem, this rare and beautiful water bird has accepted employment with the Swan Boat Management in the public garden and is entertaining boat riders with his smooth trumpet. Crowds gathered at the lake this afternoon after his arrival, and the sweet notes of his horn were heard in many parts of Boston. Lewis read the article to the end and then tore it out of the paper. Sam Beaver ought to know about this, he thought. From the writing desk on his room, Lewis took a pen and a sheet of paper. This is what he wrote. Dear Sam, I am spending the night at the Ritz in fashionable surroundings. You were right about Boston. It is very pleasant. I was able to find work as soon as I arrived. I am associated with the Swan boat at a salary of $100 a week. You may be interested in the enclosed clipping from today's paper. If all goes well, I'll soon have enough money to pay my father's debt to the music store, and then I will own the trumpet free and clear, and will hope that by blowing it passionately, I will be able to make a favorable impression on the young female I am in love with. Then everybody will be happy. My father's honor will be restored, the music shop in Billings will be repaid, and I can take a wife. I hope you are well. I miss you. A hotel room, even though it has every convenience, can be a lonely place. Your friend, Lewis. Lewis addressed an envelope to Sam, folded the letter, fitted the newspaper clipping in, and found a 6-cent stamp in his money bag. He sealed the envelope, pasted the stamp on, and dropped the letter in a mail chute outside the door of his room. Now I'll go to sleep, he thought. He went into the bathroom, used the toilet, then drew a full tub of cold water in the bathtub. He couldn't get Serena out of his mind. How wonderful it would be if only she were here. Before settling down for the night, he picked up his trumpet and played the song he had composed for her when he was in Ontario. Oh, ever in the greening spring, by bank and bough retiring, for love shall I be sorrowing, and swans of my desiring. He tried to play softly, but in a minute the phone rang in his room. Lewis lifted the receiver and put it to his ear. I'm sorry, sir, a voice said, but I'll have to ask you not to make so much noise. The Ritz does not allow its guests to play brass instruments in the bedrooms. Lewis hung up the phone and put his trumpet away. Then he turned out the lights, climbed into the tub, curved his long neck around to the right, rested his head on his back, tucked his bill under his wing, and lay there, floating on the water, his head cradled softly in his feathers. Soon he was asleep, dreaming of little lakes in the north in the springtime, dreaming of Serena, his true love.